Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Welcome to this edition of Pan African Digest. Today, the 12th of August 2026, our topic today is what I term the shame of Africa, the betrayal of Cuba. Greetings. Permit me to ask a question that should haunt every African who still possesses a functioning conscience. Why is Africa? Where is the continent that never tires of proclaiming Pan-African solidarity? Where are the presidents who invoke the names of Kwame Nkrumah, Patrice Lumumba, Amilcar Cabral, Thomas Sankara, whenever it is politically convenient? Where are the carefully choreographed declarations about African brotherhood? Where are they now that Cuba stands virtually alone? Silent. Every one of them. Silence, ladies and gentlemen, is sometimes louder than speech. There are moments when silence itself becomes a convention. And Africa's silence today is a convention of cowardice. The tiny Caribbean island of Cuba, home to fewer people than many African cities, continues to endure extraordinary economic pressure from the most powerful empire in recorded history. Whatever one's opinion of Cuba domestic policy, one fact remains beyond dispute. When Africa fought for our freedom, Cuba stood with Africa. Not with speeches, not with resolution, not with fashionable hashtags, with blood. That is the difference between revolutionary solidarity and diplomatic theater. Let us remember what this plantation supervisor governing Africa desperately want to forget. During the liberation struggles of Southern Africa, when Portugal fought to preserve its colonial empire, when apartheid South Africa invaded Angola, when white minority regimes sought to crush African aspirations beneath their military boots, who came to Africa's aid? It is not the wealthy democracies that endlessly lecture us today about human rights. It was Cuba, a small island under blockade, a nation with limited resources, yet possessing a greatness of spirit that dwarfed nations 100 times its size. More than 300,000 Cuban soldiers served in Africa over the years. Thousands never saw Havana again. Thousands sleep beneath African soil, having died not for Cuba territory, not for Cuba oil, not for Cuban diamonds, but for African freedom. Tell me which African country has made such a sacrifice for another continent? Which one? The Battle of Quito-Cuanafela changed history. It shattered the myth of the invisibility of the apartheid war machine. It accelerated Namibia's independence. It hastened the collapse of apartheid itself. Nelson Mandela never forgot. He publicly thanked Cuba. He declared that the Cuban victory at Quito-Cuanafela was a turning point in the struggle to free Southern Africa. Mandela remembered. Africa's present rulers are forgotten. And Cuba's generosity did not end on the battlefield. For decades, Cuban doctors traveled to villages where even wealthy humanitarian organizations hesitated to venture. Cuban teachers educated African children. Cuban engineers helped build capacities. Tens of thousands of African students studied medicine in Cuba, often at no cost, before returning to serve their own people and their own countries. When Ebola struck West Africa, Cuban doctors were among the first to answer the call. Not because there was money to be made, not because there were strategic minerals to exploit, not because there were military bases to establish, but because the Cuban Revolution believed that international solidarity was not a slogan, it was a duty. Compare that with with today's Africa. Our rulers queue outside foreign embassies like anxious clerks waiting for performance review. They fly from one donor conference to another, begging for loans to finance budgets they have no intention of balancing. They speak boldly only when addressing their own impoverished citizens. But when Washington clears its throat, they whisper. When Brussels raises an eyebrow, they apologize. When the IMF issues instructions, they salute. These were not the years of Nkrumah. These are plantation supervisors. Their great political achievement is learning how to administer dependency efficiently. Nkrumah warned about this tragedy decades ago. He warned that neocolonialism will produce Africans who look like rulers but govern on behalf of others. He warned that political flags will change while economic chains remain intact. How prophetic he was. Today, the African Union cannot summon the moral courage to mount a sustained diplomatic campaign in defense of one of Africa's oldest comrades. Not one coordinated continental initiative. Not one bold political offensive. Not one demonstration of gratitude equal to the sacrifices Cuba made for us. Instead, silence. The silence of frightened men. The silence of leaders who fear losing invitations to Western capitals more than losing their honor. The silence of politicians who have confused diplomacy with submission. History is watching. History is taking notes. And history is merciless towards the ungrateful. Future generations will ask simple question. When Cuba stood with Africa, where was Africa when Cuba needed friends? What shall we tell them? That our presidents were attending another investment forum, that they were negotiating another IMF program, that they were too busy composing speeches about African unity. No, the truth is more painful. Africa's political class have become intellectually colonized. A people who forgot those who bled for them have already begun to forget themselves. That is where Africa stands today, not merely ungrateful, but dangerously forgetful. Yet, I refuse to believe that Africa's people have forgotten Cuba. Governments may be cowardly, presidents may be timid, foreign ministers may calculate, but ordinary Africans remember. We remember the Cuban doctors. We remember the Cuban teachers. We remember the Cuban soldiers. We remember the Cuban martyrs whose bones rest forever beneath African sky. Their sacrifice is written into the history of our liberation. No embargo can erase that. No propaganda can rewrite it. No plantation supervisor can bury it. And so I say directly to African rulers, you may betray Cuba today. You may avert your eyes. You may calculate that silence is politically profitable, but understand this. History does not honor cowards. History does not celebrate ingrates. History remembers those who stood firm when principle demanded courage. It also remembers those who remained comfortably silent while their friends stood alone. The verdict of history is coming, and I fear it will not be kind to this generation of African rulers. Thank you for listening. Thank you, my fellow intellectual comrades, for supporting us with your generosity and for helping us to share our podcast, read our blogs, and our video blogs. You are all appreciated. Thank you very much for listening to this episode. My name is Femi Akomolafe. Until next time, enjoy your day.